Hello and welcome to today's chat all about the Trump era and horror movies, horror films, horror media as part of the Dark Hedges Film Festival. You might notice that outside my window here is a little bit brighter than our two guests, Victoria and Giuliana. That is because I am currently in Washington, D.C. That's where I'm living, for better, for worse. So at least I can say I'm geographically close to this topic, but we're lucky to have two guests that are really close to this topic academically, emotionally, probably other ways, I don't know, because they have just co-edited a book, which is just recently released, called Resist, Protest Media and Popular Culture in the Brexit-Trump Era. So I'll introduce our two guests. We have Dr. Victoria McCollum, who is a lecturer. Hello. Who's a lecturer in cinematic arts at Ulster University. She has a PhD in film studies, and in 2019, she also edited the publication Make America Hate Again, Trump Era Horror and the Politics of Fear. Lots to unpack there. And we also have the lovely Dr. Giuliana Monteverde, who is a writer, researcher, academic, and she also holds a PhD in media studies. So welcome to you both. Thank you for joining the call from zooming in across the ocean together. I'm going to kick it off just by asking about the topic. What do we mean when we say Trump and horror? You know, I know Trump was in Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, but we're not probably talking about the man himself and his film career. What do we mean when we talk about Trump and horror, and what makes this era so interesting to delve into? Maybe Victoria, you could.
Yeah, sure. I think that when I kind of got interested in making the book about Trump era horror, it was kind of, I just started asking myself, has horror become the film genre of the Trump era in some way? And I think the answer to that was very much yes. And we all know that popular horror films reflect and express and kind of validate the spirit of the era, no matter what era we're in. But yeah, I wanted to kind of examine if horror had changed. And obviously Trump's election was kind of hotly contested and it was very dramatic. And I wanted to understand like how recent horror films and television shows and even horror podcasts and that kind of thing, how they give meaning to the American nightmare that is Trump.
Cool. And Giuliana, like what was your interest then in creating this book?
I suppose I like followed Brexit and Trump with a similar type of horror. You know, they happened in fairly quick succession. They were both shocking politically and culturally. We are interested in general in how like various types of media speak to, reflect, or set the boundaries of the conversations that we have when it comes to like politics and everyday life. So it kind of made sense to explore the era through the media, and that was kind of in a variety of different ways. So like media that was specifically about or speaking to the issues kind of raised by the Trump administration, and then also media or media figures that kind of existed on the periphery of that as well.
Yeah, totally. I think as well, when you talk about, or when people like Trump take office, you usually find it's a bit like the Bush era. There's this quick turnaround of deeply conservative narratives in film and television. And horror then kind of emerges as this counter narrative to all of that stuff. But yeah, maybe we could talk about that later, of course. But yeah, so horror then kind of emerges in response to a turbulent political climate, but one in which the people like Trump are pumping out all of these other narratives. So it's an interesting one. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like, it's like a release valve, I think, you know, when you go see a film, when you're just scared in your everyday life and you have so much emotions and you go see a horror film and you just scare yourself. It's just really a release, I think, for a lot of people. It's funny because I think especially over here, like the news moves so quickly and there's, you know, I know there's 24-hour news everywhere, but like it's just every day there's like a new tweet that's just really unprecedented or really strange, or, you know, I mean, there's a plot to kidnap the governor like the other day. Like, it's like, I cannot. I cannot keep up. And that's almost a difficulty for film in a way, because obviously there's such long lead times, whereas, you know, with social media and like TikTok and like memes and stuff like that, we can really like pump out and reply to things really quickly. But I was thinking about a film like Get Out, which obviously was conceived kind of during the Obama sort of era, was released kind of during Trump's presidency, but you can kind of read it. It maybe makes more sense. I don't know if you agree. If it was a Clinton presidency, that film actually it's kind of mocking like white liberals, kind of almost makes more sense in that presidency, but it works as well also in the Trump presidency. I don't know if anyone wanted to speak to that film in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to say something about the speed comment that you made. I think that's a really interesting one. And Giuliana, maybe we can chat about Get Out, but that everything's happening so quickly, and it seems like film is almost too slow to kind of deal with things. I mean, usually it takes 7 to 10 years for films to deal with some big kind of piece of cultural turmoil, like 9/11, for example. It takes a decade for film to actually properly deal with that. But yeah, even if you look at like pandemic horror, I think that pandemic horror cinema speeds up the slow violence of the pandemic so that political stakes become even more apparent. So I think there's an interesting kind of conversation to be had in how that works. But yeah, I think and as well, pandemic horror, for example, is always about eating the rich, and I think The Purge kind of fits into that in a way. It's an interesting one, where it's all about that kind of the engine of middle class preservation in some way. But yeah, I think that Get Out is really interesting because it's that like really effective blend of horror and commentary and comedy as well. I think that's why it's so good, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I decided to read a little bit about Trump just in preparation for this, and I obviously follow like American politics anyway, but it was shocking. I just went to Google Trump news, and like the amount of stuff I just don't know about, despite like, and the kidnapping attempt on the governor of, I think it's Michigan, is it? Yeah, never heard of that before, couldn't believe it. And very like scary, kind of very scary, what was the way to put it? Addressing of what Trump is calling suburban women and like housewives. He's kind of using like 1950s vernacular, which I found like, really, we're there again.
Yeah.
But yes, in terms of Get Out, I actually read earlier that Jordan Peele was planning that kind of around the time of Trayvon Martin's death. So yeah, it was a really like significantly long time. It was in production before Trump, I think, had even announced his candidacy. And so like when they made that film, it was a kind of, this is what could happen, but not in the literal, sense that Trump actually was elected. But I think that the ending of Get Out as well was affected by kind of racial and political climate in America at the time. I know that they made it a slightly less dark ending because they thought that for the audience it would be just too much. So I think that's interesting in the context of what was to come in America in the next couple of years,
Yeah, absolutely. I think Get Out's so interesting because it's like you would think that a film like that would examine the explicit racism of white supremacists. That would be the kind of most straightforward, convenient way of putting a horror film about what it's about together. But it actually examines instead the like
the nuance of it.
Yeah, it's like it examines the bigotry of liberal white Americans in an interesting way. I think it's just it kind of skewers and critiques race relations, and it's interesting in that way. But I think it's all about like the tensions are all wrapped up in it being a purportedly like post-racial America, and we know that it's not, of course. Mm-hmm. But yeah, what you were saying, Giuliana, about like it emerges as it does in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement and mass incarceration and police brutality, and neo-Nazis and tearing down Confederate monuments. But yeah, and it kind of, I think, embodies, I assume, the fears of being a Black person in a white society. But it's a really, really interesting film.
Yeah, I read Jordan Peele say that he hadn't seen a movie that expressed the horror of being the only Black person in a crowd of only white people. And that
yeah, totally
refers to it as social horror, but yeah, I think that it's the more like nuanced, the microaggression, the kind of like gaslighting of no, we're not actually racist, but if you're color in America, you know that that isn't true. So the like dual identity, double consciousness that kind of has to operate there, and I think he does that in Us as well, and plays with that idea of like, yeah, being part of one identity group and having to navigate, you know, another one, or one
of course,
very existence.
And about how the, like, you know, those always present structures of racism that sustain white spaces all the time. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's cool because Get Out is like the scariest new film about the oldest of American horrors, you know, and that's why it works so well.
I know I was reading about like just like Jordan Peele is always, he just seems like a big horror film nerd, like he loves like horror, and that he was kind of, he said he was inspired by things like Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives, because that's about being like a woman and being afraid of something as a woman that everyone else is not afraid of, but he made that about race for this film. So it's just really fascinating how like a horror, like in every, like you said, like in every decade, it completely just takes those underlying fears and kind of makes them into a monster, you know, that is somehow less scary than just something you can't.
And I think as well in the horror genre, whiteness has always been synonymous with death and the bringing about of death. But it seems like in Trump era horror, narratives of like white male anger have really proliferated and become much more popular again. If you look at Don't Breathe and Get Out and It Comes at Night and The Neighbor and maybe even The Walking Dead and The Witch and The Women, there's just that's kind of really picking up speed again. Some of the really interesting ones, just to kind of go back to your point when you were talking about kind of women there's been a really interesting body of work since about 2010, and it's this increasing number of films where, to use your word, where the monster is a white man, but it's this interesting thing where one of the most predominant tropes is that a woman is discovered chained or caged in a cellar or a basement. And I think it's really interesting because it kind of emerges from this sense of men's powerlessness. But I think that if you look at the timing of that, 2010, it emerged after the Great Recession of 2008, and it becomes this central trope. And it also ties into that like clarion call of Trump's in his election to lock her up. And it kind of plays on men's antagonism towards powerful women. And you really see that in these films. Like if you look at The Women or Don't Breathe or The Neighbor, they seem so much about men's felt loss of power and the desire to kind of readdress and avenge that loss. It's interesting.
I think there's maybe a bit of that in Us as well. I don't know if you've seen it, but yeah, there seems to be sort of an extension of that when it comes to race as well as gender, where there's this kind of like unearthing of people that have previously been ignored. You know?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's probably like what's so interesting about Trump. And I do think Trump is kind of fascinating. I'm more kind of interested in Trumpism than Trump because he's kind of not interesting at all. But he, like, the Trump era appears to me like this tale of two paths. So on one hand, Trump occupies the position of yet another elite. He is the billionaire class. He is a poster boy of excessive consumption. And then on the other, and as my father reminds me constantly, because he really gets a lot out of Trump, right? He serves as this almost messianic figure, you know, to people suffering from economic deprivation and political alienation and humiliation as well. And it's really interesting because it's like that tale of two paths, and you see that kind of emerge in horror.
Yeah, and I feel like there hasn't been, like, there's been very few, like, to my knowledge, of direct like films that are kind of skewering him directly. Like it's a lot of, there's a lot, it's almost difficult, I think, you know, if in 5 years time, 10 years time, to make a film about this time that has Trump in it, because he's such a like he's so at home on TV, like, and he's so like attuned to the media that he's already this kind of entertainer character. So it's very hard to actually, I think, to portray him. I know, I don't know if you've seen it, the Comey Rule was like a little mini series, and Brendan Gleeson was Trump. Yeah. So I was like, I gotta tune in and see Brendan Gleeson as Trump. And it was really, like, I think he did such a good job with it. But I think it's a tough call, and maybe, you know, maybe that's not what people want to see. Maybe people want to see something it is what you're anxious about, but it's not actually like politics. Like something like The Purge is very like the first Purge is really just similar. It's really just taking stuff from the news and making it into a horror. But that, like, we've seen a lot of like supernatural horrors and stuff, like you've mentioned, around gender and stuff. So it's kind of reflecting things, but not in a direct way. I don't know. Do you think there would ever be like a kind of you know, an archetypal film of this era that's about Trump and about the White House? You think that's too tough to do?
Do you want to?
I think that it's strange, because any film about xenophobia or nationalism or racism or misogyny or anti-Semitism or anti-immigrant rhetoric ends up being about Trump, you know? And I think that kind of sentiment is tied to horror after 9/11 anyway, so it's an interesting one in and of itself. But it's really hard to predict how, I mean, I think horror in the future, and I don't want to get into predicting what horror will do, because I just don't want to be that guy, you know, but I think that the key direction will be more complexity, because filmmakers like Jordan Peele and Robert Eggers are pushing forward by looking into the past. And actually, when you talk about explicitly referencing things, that really gets critics' blood up. And horror then is criticized and seen as kind of occupied with glib and trendy and not so much plotted as delivered political metaphors, and people get really angry. I think fans get angry about that, critics get really annoyed about that, and that what it does is that if you're too explicit and too cliched about it, it lessens the genre standing as something that's plugged into social and historical context in compelling, persuasive ways. And many like critics and scholars get really angry about that, and many refuse to bend the knee through the kind of zeitgeist. They say, you know, I think when you're talking about The Purge, it was a journalist for Sight and Sound, a guy called Nick Pinkerton, and he wrote this really great article, and he said, The Purge has things to say about contemporary America, but who doesn't and who cares? You know, so it's like there's a real body of people that are really dissatisfied and dispirited and depressed with contemporary horror. You know, because we expect critique and satire from a broadly leftist political POV, and they get really annoyed when it doesn't have the same tangible teeth as kind of Romero, you know?
Yeah, and like how much, I know, Giuliana, you've talked about this before, about how like critics' readings of media kind of play into how we consume it, and how much are we just reading into what we want, or how much of it is actually from the artist or the filmmaker?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I was reading interviews from Jordan Peele and also Ari Aster, who made Midsummer and Hereditary. Ari Aster said any film should reflect the time when it was made, so like fairly, you know, specific, on the nose, like this is about this. And in the interview, actually was willing to kind of say, yes, that's correct, that isn't correct, which lots of directors really won't participate in. On the other hand, John Krasinski, who directed A Quiet Place, was quite resistant to ideas that it was a political allegory or that it could be read in a political way. And it was actually read both from a leftist and a right-wing perspective, you know, on the one hand, that it was about the fear of not being able to speak up or speak out, but on the other hand, that it was about this kind of like family, the preservation of the nuclear family through surviving and being quiet. So yeah, there's a chapter in our upcoming book that's kind of about this and about how critics shape the way we think about films. And I would agree with Victoria that it's a very fine line to tread, you know, in terms of the actual content. Sorry, just having a wee look at my notes here.
Yeah, I think when you're talking, it's really interesting that you bring up your man John from The Office, right? That's Jim, right?
Yes,
That's how he loves to
Me. Really annoys me. I don't want to watch him and Pam any longer, honestly. Like, I'm just there for Oscar and maybe a little bit Creed. But I feel like that John is always trying to kind of, he was the one that came up with that nonsense about elevated horror, like The Quiet Place is this elevated horror film. It's not really a horror film.
Centrist, isn't it? It's very
yeah, and like he's ghettoizing it again, and he's trying to distance himself. That's why he said, "Ooh, this is really a family, family tragedy." It's just like, John, it's a horror film. Like, get over it.
The fact that he's filmed and made it with his wife as well. Like,
it just passed me a bucket. I mean, really.
Yeah, it does add another bit to that insistence. Just like a nice
it's so typical of Jim. I feel like he's just don't even get me started on him. But
yes, this chapter in our book, it says that critics are the first people that kind of, they canonize things, they theorize it, they contextualize it, and they do it in an accessible way so that audiences are able to then navigate that, and they do that as a much faster process than academics are going to do, which, as you said, the filmmaking process takes a long time. The time it takes for academics to get things published takes an even longer time. So yes, they're a useful kind of conduit there, critics, to be able to contextualize what it is these movies are about.
Absolutely, yeah, I 100% agree with that. It's a really good point, and it's an interesting thing to think about. I think as well, it's just, if Trump represents this evolution of sorts, and this is kind of really what made us want to make the book, because Trump is this, like, he represents just another step in the merger between entertainment and celebrity and politics. Like, he's this first candidate to pursue politics as entertainment, and he kind of collapses the distinction between entertainment and news and politics, and so he gives way to this aggressive form of authoritarian populism, which has created this mass movement. So I think Trumpism will long outlast Trump, which is the sad thing, because he's a brand and he's a media spectacle, and he accumulates power and capital and followers and leaves a legacy that lasts for a long time. And like, not to mention that the ways he's worked to curtail the freedom of the press. I mean, it's a scary thing. And you saw that a lot with the Bush administration too. There's this like manufacturing of distraction the whole time, and it's very real, very real.
And it's funny in that, like, obviously, the US is, I guess, one of the world's greatest superpower. There's so much, and the English speaking as well, a lot of it. So we get so much US news over in Western Europe, and all around the world. And obviously the Hollywood, like the movie industry, is based there. But, those movies are exported, not just to people in the UK and Ireland, but, to China is a huge market, even in the US itself, like people voted for, like, a lot of people voted for Trump. So you can't just it's difficult to make a film that's saying, like, this person is wrong and have it be a huge, exported all over the world type of film. So it's just interesting how kind of critics navigate that, and then also how we're looking at film in different places across the world. And I know it was interesting, like the Oscars, obviously, Parasite won, 4 Oscars, and like, what an amazing film, but such a
it's incredible.
It's so good, but it definitely seemed like a statement, perhaps on the part of the Academy, to around. I know they had the Oscars So White thing a few years ago that's still kind of simmering there, but also the immigration and trying to open up to a wider worldview. So that thing around critics, which I guess the Academy are, like, making a statement on what films they choose to kind of push up, not saying that didn't deserve it. But it is interesting how then that was, it's created in South Korea, but it's very similar to, something like Us, which is looking at the class conflict and rich and poor, which anyone, I think, most places in the world can really dig into.
I think that Parasite is really, like, perhaps part of its success is to do with the like globalization and the fact that its message can be, it works in so many contexts, and then they also do use America in that movie as a sort of like what you're saying about cultural imperialism, basically when you export your kind of culture's values to other countries. That's made a real thing of in Parasite in terms of the Native American imagery. The fact that the
Oh, of course, yeah. I wasn't even aware of that. Yeah, of course. It's a really good point.
fact that the toys are ordered from Amazon, like the use of English speaking and English language, you know, there's globalization kind of themes going on there. While I was preparing for this, I was reading about horror. Victoria's a horror specialist. I'm not. And so I was reading about the kind of different eras, right? So like the Bush administration and the propensity of torture porn, and like Saw and Hostel, and how that's related to torture of the time and images of the time. And then there was the Obama era, which has the kind of the financial unease and the ghost paranormal movies that have this unsettling. So I was trying to figure out what Trump's kind of is. And as I was reading through this, I realized like Us, Parasite, Get Out, Annihilation, and Midsummer all deal with like doppelgangers or doubles or disguise or some
shadow selves,
some sense of like replacing and displacing. And I thought it was maybe like identity horror, you know, like so there's we've talked about like social horror, but yes, the horror of like having to see things from other people's perspective, you know. Like a lot of Midsummer is about mirroring and the potential danger in that, but also the freedom in that, and you know, about like finding your people and kind of having this like having a collective group, which is also a theme in all of those movies, I think. So I thought that was maybe an interesting response to or way of theorizing or thinking about like whatever era horror we're kind of in now, horror at least made, you know, within this presidency or with an awareness that it would be released in this presidency.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mirroring thing is really interesting, especially if I think that what we tend to do when trying to define an era of horror is you look at the rhetorics of horror and what it's kind of calling on and calling forth. And if you look even like, I mean, one of the major tropes to kind of come out of the book is that, okay, clown horror is back because of Trump. So monstrous clowns have long been a cultural icon, you know, from the moment Pennywise crawled out of the sewer and into the culture.
They're just very scary. They're just like extremely. I can't.
They are. And I think that they're scary because it's that subversion of the traditional comic character, you know, who's like this alchemy of violence and nostalgia. And I think the clown horror is crucial to our understanding of the Trump era, because Trump and Trumpism appear to kind of embody all that we find horrifying in the chaos that the clown signifies. And that kind of archaic conservatism has proven really attractive to Trump's core supporters for the same reason. So I think, I mean, it's interesting to note that the killer clown in Trump era horror is this kind of genderless evil. Thinking of Pennywise in the latest hit, who kind of wears makeup and whose body morphs at will. And it feels like Pennywise, for example, then when you're talking about mirroring, Giuliana, that Pennywise kind of calls forth and calls on like that political rhetoric of femophobia and transphobia that has catalyzed Trump's election in some way. So it's
like the uncertainty. It's the who belongs where, and like
totally,
to take it to again, sorry, Parasite, but yes, the fact that there can be replacement and that you don't know which is which. You know, that like just what you said about the kind of morphing.
Absolutely.
Yes, in that context, it kind of brings forth the anti-immigration rhetoric, or you know, the stuff about kind of walls and keeping people out and the protection of American values, whatever it is that's supposed to mean.
Absolutely. It's a really good point.
That's then maintained by kind of class and wealth and power, and that there's always a consequence of that. Like in Us, you know, there's a consequence to the behavior of the people on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
There are other people attached, you know, and in Parasite, you know, the director, Bo Jong-hoon, he goes to lots of effort to kind of draw parallels between the two, you know, whatever way it's shot, the way that it kind of goes downhill, the fact that the rains affect the poor people in a much more kind of visceral and literal way than it does the upper class people. It seems, that there's lots of tethering and attachments, and that they're kind of reiterating the like the connectivity that we have, or our complicity, you know, in our ignorance, in our actions, does actually have consequence kind of further down.
Yeah, the parallels are really interesting, and that's another thing that kind of came out of the book. And popular horror often stands accused of being really misogynistic, you know, and one of the most striking features, I think, of Trump era horror and Trump's election is the degree to which it inspired this upsurge in female-led protests and female protagonists and queer protagonists. So, you know, now you have this body of films like 10 Cloverfield Lane. I'm not sure if you've seen it. And if you think about Hush, for example, and Don't Breathe, you have films that show women fighting back against violent, sadistic men. And that's not actually that common to do it in that way in horror. And I think those films deal with like questions of gender and power, and that like growing sense of anger at those really rigid patriarchal structures in the US. But also if you look at queer horror, you know, queer representation horror has long been this kind of cultural narrative of punishment and invisibility, you know, ultimately depressing films. Yet these depictions have kind of turned away from that, and now it's about narratives of survival. It's really cool. That's why the Babadook, this kind of campy androgynous monster, remains confined to the basement in a Trump era horror film, and he's now a kind of queer icon at pride parades. So it's just another way in which, with all of this really depressing stuff, can come these little silver linings. You know, it's pretty cool. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's funny that I love that the Babadook kind of meme that the Babadook is a queer icon. But it's funny because it's so like the director would never have, I don't think, envisioned that happening, and that just happened through people like making these memes and the internet just like really quickly recycling everything, and that was something actually would get out. It became such a, like, you know, sunken place. It's like we all know kind of what that means, and people talk about like Kanye, and there's so much now that people are taking these and kind of putting their own meanings onto it. And even if you haven't seen these films, you're kind of getting it. It's taking off in pop culture, and so they're kind of taking on a life of their own, and people are like changing them to their own ends, which I guess just didn't happen so much in like the 60s and 70s, really, outside of just discussion if you've seen something in cinema, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. It's even if you look at how like horror podcasts are taking off now in post-truth America. They dominate iTunes top 10, and they are that more grassrootsy thing where people have made these at home, and they appear to hold this unique insight into Trump's unfolding America. You know, it's really interesting because in a world of like visual iconography, you have this illicit world of podcast audio that is ironically the most truthful thing. You know, it's interesting.
It's also the double-sided nature of like Trump's presidency, which you've kind of already said, and social media in the way that it has lots of like radical liberatory outcomes in terms of connecting people to ideas and communities that they wouldn't have connected to otherwise. Like the sunken place is it's a nuanced, a creative way. It's a new form of language of describing, you know, a type of estrangement from Black identity. Like we wrote a chapter on Kanye for our book, actually, and his kind of relationship with Trump, and how he uses the Kardashians to kind of mediate that. But yes, there is lost my train of thought. What was I talking about?
I think what you're saying is just that some of the most powerful images.
Right, yeah, sorry, the double thing, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that like it allows you, the social media allows you to have that language, the sunken place, which reflects a kind of complex and important thing. But also social media is the place where lots of like hate speech and racism and misogyny, etc. It breeds. Like we know that we've got, like, on the one hand, an increase of like popular feminism, say, and kind of the positive outcomes of the Black Lives Matter movement, etc. We've got more language, more diversity, more all of those good things. But on the other hand, we also have an increase of misogyny and hate crime and hate speech, and those things are unfortunately going together. And yeah, that's happening on social media as well, in terms of these kind of concepts where you get that great stuff like the Babadook, you know.
Absolutely.
And the kind of like a way to discuss Kanye, you know, that's using terms from a Black filmmaker in contemporary times. Like, that's sophisticated and it's important, and there wasn't access to that before in terms of how we talk about media and identity and how those things affect our lives. I think it's really positive, and it's fast, as you said. You know, there's quicker turnover than there is from like getting the newspaper and reading the weekly column on, you know, the films that are out.
Yeah, and like horror has always had, like, it's always been really fan based. So I think like it's always had communities of people that are like super into horror. So I think of any of the genres, it like produces those things really quickly, or like things just become like a hit, you know, through word of mouth rather than marketing for horror. Like a lot of horror is very low budget as well. So it's kind of nice in that way.
Like I'm not a classic horror fan. I would have been one of those people that would have said, I don't like horror, like why would you scare yourself, etc. And I haven't seen lots of kind of canonical horror texts, and the reason that I have seen all these ones that I have is it really is because of that. It's because of social media. It's because I know that this film is going to be clever or important when it comes to things like race, you know, or that it's going to be a type of horror that I haven't seen before, or that I can go and see Midsummer and experience something like, as a woman, you know, that I'm not going to be killed off in the first half an hour, actually assaulted in the second, like, you know.
Yeah, I think one of the best things you can look up on YouTube as well is just, and they've been created by horror fans, is just horror trailers featuring Trump where they've intercut. Like one of the best is Get Out of the White House.
It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah, because I mean, and many of these little fan-based trailers offer the most incisive social commentary of Trump's rise to power, you know, in really interesting ways. And they can be understood, I think, as this kind of broader trend by comedians and protesters and political commentators who are using horror parody as a way of both critiquing and resisting that presidency and all that it stands for.
Yeah, it really does reshape like how media works in terms of, you know, media in society. It's not such a like linear or like lengthy process. It's a much more like iterative, fast one. I also saw there was some suggestion from Ivanka Trump, I think, that Midsummer was about her, like finding herself at the DNC convention. You know, like they tried to kind of use that as like these weird libs. Yeah, that it was kind of like a horror, like a socialist horror, basically, about like the problems of collectivity, etc. I know. But yeah, interesting at least for them to kind of be using those terms to describe themselves, bizarrely.
I think as well, one of the most interesting things for me is how like some of horror's most powerful images have been created outside of live action horror films. So you talk about the internet memes and the horror trailers. It's really interesting, and even children's animated film. Like if you think of Hotel Transylvania 2, it's very much a Trump era horror film. Or if you think about how South Park is utilizing horror now, it's just really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain more about the Hotel Transylvania horror? Because I just love the franchise and would just like to.
Yeah, I mean, I can try. Yeah, first of all, there's really archaic impulses that lurk behind it. And I think it's because it's produced by Adam Sandler, who's a staunch Republican and Trump supporter. So if you watch that film, and I advise you to, look out for kind of racist, sexist, and homophobic undertones in recent children's horror, actually. And it's just kind of really interesting. I think the film, if I remember correctly, is about, it kind of tells the tale of Dracula and his daughter Mavis, and how traditional American family values unite monsters and humans, yet in kind of true Trump era fashion, it actually shows the complete opposite. So Drac spends the entire film securing a border around his hotel where no outsiders, humans, can enter, whilst just manipulating his daughter constantly. And it's how the monsters are signified that's really problematic in Hotel Transylvania 2. And I'm not saying that kids are going to understand this, but they're probably going to pick up some kind of subliminal message. So the monsters are just watch it and see how the monsters are signified. There's just really like, it just touts sexist and gender roles and stereotypes bordering on racism. Like there's some definite really explicit anti-Semitic tropes in there. So anyway, the film both just kind of denies and reinforces ethnicity and misogyny and homophobia through the vehicle of the, you know, great all-inclusive American family. It's one to watch. And there's a dinner scene. Just watch the party buffet scene and how the monsters are signified. I mean, it's really quite.
I'm sure I've seen it, and I think I liked it in the sense that it was a pleasant enough animated film. You know.
Yeah, of course.
Yes, I didn't have. I don't think I had my critical.
Yeah, or if you look at like even South Park, is really staging horror in a very specific way. If you look at any episode that revolves around the member berries, probably go into another time, but yeah, it's an interesting one.
I know. I think in like TV, especially, it's just we've always said we're in the golden age of TV, but there's so much we could spend another time talking about, like all of the series that are on, and like Handmaid's Tale and Lovecraft Country, American Horror Story, and there's so much. But I'm gonna finish it up, and the last thing I'm gonna ask you, for a little bit of fun, is we're all gonna be sadly probably quite locked down over Halloween, spooky season. I know, Giuliana, you and me, we're not like massive horror fans, so you can pick something else if you like. But I just wanted to ask, like, what kind of spooky watch are you gonna curl up on the couch with for Halloween?
Yeah, first of all, when is that ever a fun question, right? Getting this question, I am so
I'll go first, and you can go through your Rolodex. Because I knew I was going to ask this question. So I always really like The Fog by John Carpenter. I don't think it's maybe The Fog represents something. I'm sure it does, but I don't read it as a political film. But I just love it. It's so scary, but also really relaxing. Because like the main character is a radio and a sexy nighttime radio voice. Such an amazing voice, such an amazing actor. So it's a really good watch. And apart from that, probably if there's any of the Simpsons Halloween specials, I always like those.
Oh yeah, the Treehouse of Horror, right? Oh, the new one's out next week. The Fog is a great film, and she is amazing. It's a bit like my love for Roz Doyle from Frasier as well. It's just something about those voices. Anyway. So I really don't like zombie films. I just find them kind of annoying and boring. I really do. I just can't get with them. I respect them. I don't like them. I think it's because if I was being chased by hordes, I would probably just try and, jump into the sea or something. I wouldn't even try to fight, because it would be pointless. But one of the films I think I would like to recommend, and one of the films I will watch myself, is a Canadian film called Pontypool. It's by this guy called Bruce McDonald, and it was out, I think, towards the end of the 2000s, and 2010, 2008 maybe. But for me, this is like the most innovative zombie picture of the past decade. It revolves around this radio host, as he interprets the possible outbreak of this deadly virus, which infects small town in Ontario, where he's stationed. But here's what's really cool about it. It's a linguistic virus. So it spreads when the words it has infected are spoken and understood by a living host, who becomes a zombie, compelled to repeat the words, passing the disease on to others. So for me, it's such a good film, but it's also this allegory about the sometimes lethal effect of mass media, especially the kind of inflammatory discourse associated with people like Trump, because in the age of Trump, where the chief populist Twitterer is the master of 140 character politics, the film is really as sharp as a blade. So I recommend Pontypool.
In terms of horror, I've been talking about it loads, but I love Us, and I'll probably watch it again. While I was preparing for this, even just every image of Lupita Nyong'o, I was like, yes, it's just so good. So that, but also I am 3 seasons deep in Lost rewatch. Ooh. And I just must recommend it to everyone in the world. I know it has its nonsense attached to it, but it's a creepy, thrilling, suspenseful, it's a great ride, especially
I must revisit. I'm like knee deep in Ratched right now, which is awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, now is the time. This is the year of the binge rewatching of things, because if you can't do it this year, but But look, thank you so much for joining today. Thanks to everyone for watching. I'll just mention again, if you want to dive deeper into this, your book is Resist, Protest Media and Popular Culture in the Brexit-Trump Era. I presume you can get it at like all good.
Every major bookstore.
Excellent. So yeah, I wish you both a very safe and spooky Halloween. And thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Sure thing. Thanks, Colette.
Bye. Thank you.